All right, a little bit about our speaker. Our speaker for today is Dr. Craig J. Shelby. He is a qualitative and historic researcher. He has been involved in tertiary education and management since 1993 and has lectured and supervised research students at universities and polytechnics in several Asia Pacific countries. He is multidisciplinary in outlook. His undergraduate degree in socio-economic geography, masters in economic development, and doctoral work in economics and globalization. He holds additional postgraduate qualifications in tertiary teaching and learning and has a keen interest in educational management and facilitation development. Craig's career started in learning support, which is why he chooses to be first and foremost a teacher and a mentor, and only then as a researcher. He is the principal and co founder of the Third Degree, an academic resource platform for postgraduate students, and is now devoted to providing solutions to help empower research. So, our schedule for the next 3 days is as shown. So, for day one, we have sort of amended the schedule. Day one will be tackling copyright issues and grey literature. Day two will be image use and creation, as well as reverse outlines. And day three will be explaining complex ideas, paraphrasing, and unplagiarizing. So, at the end of each session, there will be a Q&A session, at which point you are free to utilize the chat box or raise your hand, and also at any point of the session you can also put up any questions that you may have. Okay, after the 3 days I'll be sending out an email to all of you regarding your one-to-one session, so do keep a lookout. Okay, so Dr. Craig, on to you.
Great, thanks very much. I guess I see that wonderful photo you shared of me and realize I look a little bit different these days. I really should update my photo. First of all, welcome everybody. It's great to see some familiar faces here tonight, but also to meet some new people as well. So looking forward to running through the topics over the next 3 days to talk about issues related to writing your thesis. For the purpose of tonight, we're covering 2 topics, which will be copyright in your thesis. And this is really looking at the relevance and the importance of copyright issues. Now, it is boring, it is dry, so, you know, hopefully you won't fall asleep. But what it is essential, because it's not only about protecting our own work, it's issues about who owns the work we do, who owns our data. And when we embrace other scholars' work within our own, what are the rights and responsibilities, and how do we circumvent some of these? So it's a very important topic. We're then going to go on and talk about grey literature. And that is also quite important because I find grey literature really brilliant in terms of shaping some of the thinking, even if it doesn't get cited in the final dissertation or the final research output. But it's certainly something that we need to be able to explore, and I want to encourage you to look and to understand it and to see how grey literature can interplay with your own writing, not only now as a PhD dissertation, but further down the track with any other research projects or research undertakings that you might be doing. I changed the order of topics a little bit for a couple of reasons. One, because I wanted to go from the boring through to the extremely practical, and the new adjustment of topics actually allows for that. Two, because 2 of the sessions are pre-recorded, which is actually what you're getting tonight. So you won't be seeing this face particularly, you'll be seeing a slightly older one. But I will be playing 2 pre-recorded sessions just to make sure that you guys get all the content that I wanted to get across. Because of that, there is no need to have your camera on tonight. But when you come to the Q&A session at the end of the night, I'll be here the whole night. But when we come to the Q&A session at the end, it would be appreciated if you turn your cameras on. As you can imagine, you know, talking to a black screen is not the most exciting thing to do. Please do ask questions via the chat. I'll address them at the end, but if there's something really specific or really interesting from your questions, perhaps I'll also look at them in the short intermission that we take during the session. The next two nights are certainly live in the fact that you really do have to look at me, but they're also going to be a little bit more interactive as well. So tomorrow night, we're going to talk about image use and creation. And this is also about, how do we construct figures, tables, diagrams? How do we utilize other scholars' figures, tables, diagrams? How can we, or what are the limits to what we can do? And then also, what are some of the practical aspects of this as well? We live in a digital color world, but the dissertation is black and white. So as you can imagine, there's always going to be some challenges from not only a design perspective, but let's just say a real common sense perspective. We're also going to talk about reverse outlines. And this is a way of looking at and ensuring and in some respects restructuring the flow of your writing. So it's a technique that's used globally just to help keep you on track with the writing that you have, but also to make sure that as you continue to develop your writing, you don't deviate too much. As we write, we tend to deviate. We have new ideas. We think about things differently. And what we had in mind goes off track. So this is a way of looking at where it might have gone off track and how we bring it back, or how we reflow the work that we've got. And on Monday, we're going to look at explaining complex ideas. So taking taking complex things and making them simpler. I've always believed that part of the research student challenge is related to the communication of your ideas, not only to the academics who are judging you, sorry, I should say assessing you, but judging you and examining you, but actually to all of the stakeholders that are part of our research journey, those who contributed to the data, those who benefit from perhaps the findings and the recommendations that you have as well. And then the final one, which is the most important, I think probably the real reason most people are here, is paraphrasing and unplagiarizing. And let's just call it unplagiarizing, because it is about how do we take other people's words, put them seamlessly into our dissertation, and how to avoid those evil plagiarism checkers like Turnitin and other things like that. But on a bigger scale, it's about how to embrace the words of others and weave them into the narrative that you are writing so that it comes across strong, but also comes across that you haven't stolen other people's words. So what I'll do for now is we're going to do, for the first half this evening, copyright in your thesis. The video is about 1 hour and 50, so we're probably going to go about five minutes over for the whole of this evening. So bear with me for that. We'll do the section on copyright and your thesis. We'll then go into grey literature. And as I said, do feel free to give any questions that you have through the chat box, and again, also at the end. First of all, I am going to have to make an apology. Tonight's topic is, it's actually super boring in many respects, so don't expect jokes. It's somewhat technical and procedural in nature, and therefore by default becomes rather dry. But understanding where we stand as researchers with the fundamental issues of copyright is extremely important to our growth and to our development as researchers. And ultimately, it makes us stronger as researchers, as communicators, and as authors. If you find that tonight's webinar helps you sleep, drop my team an email and I'll send you the link, and that will help you with future nights of insomnia. Anyway, let's move on to the discussion at hand, copyright and your thesis. Knowledge is valuable. Researchers build on established knowledge and on research results and thoughts communicated by their peers. An intrinsic part of being a researcher is publishing and disseminating one's own work. But this also involves questions of authorship and rights. And that's what we're here to focus on this evening. Through the discussion, I'm going to take 4 perspectives, or 4 viewpoints perhaps, from where we stand. The author perspective, the co-author or shared authorship or shared ownership perspective, because not everything we own ourselves in terms of the research that we've done. I'm going to take an institutional perspective, and finally an end user perspective. Ultimately speaking, an academic author should know how work is protected by copyright, what it means to assign or transfer copyright to others, and I think that's probably the biggest eye-opener we have out of tonight's session. And finally, how to avoid infringement of other authors' copyright. In our undergraduate years, we'll call it plagiarism, but in terms of a thesis and full-on publication, whether it be a thesis, a journal article, a book chapter, or a book itself out of our research journey and journeys, it does become copyright. So why do we need to understand copyright? In the academic context, copyright is primarily about getting the most from your scholarly work, and it's less about the legal complications with threats and possible liabilities. Attention to detail and attention to copyright helps to avoid pitfalls, but it also can reveal opportunities for us as we further our scholarly goals. Given the way that the law operates, copyright law most certainly protects our dissertations, as well as the quotations, photographs, music, diagrams, or any other work that you have included in your doctoral study. The decisions you make about copyright can directly affect the quality of your work, your ability to publish your dissertation, and your opportunities for building upon years of research throughout your career. Let's start off by considering a few common practical examples of copyright's relationship to your dissertation. In the academic context, it's primarily about getting the most from your scholarly work and less about, my copy and paste went badly there. Let's start with 3 particular case studies. Photographs, art, and architecture. Very simple. Alice is completing her dissertation on art and architectural history and wants to include a variety of photographs, drawings, and artistic renderings from throughout the 20th century. Nearly all of these works are protectable by copyright. We can ponder whether it is when a copyright owner does not show up to object, it becomes a serious nuisance, or even worse. At the very least, Alice may find herself scrambling to secure permissions or dealing with objections as they arise, with the ensuing prospect of modifying her dissertation or blocking online access to it. Alice's solution? With a little advanced planning, she can explore her options, evaluate fair use, secure any needed permissions, and even find alternative images that are in the public domain or licensed for these particular uses, including the many issues available on the web with Creative Commons licenses, something we'll talk about later. Attending to copyright matters early can prevent complications and delay in filing her dissertation. The reality here is just because it's available doesn't mean we're actually allowed to use it. And this gives evaluators an opportunity to pick us up on something that we've forgotten or omitted or failed to do. Let's take a look at a second scenario, a chemistry journal article. Belinda successfully published 2 articles in leading chemistry journals during her years as a graduate student. When the journals were originally accepted for publication, she and her advisor were delighted, and Belinda was happy to move the articles as quickly as possible
towards publication. She's now preparing her final dissertation, and it will include full reprints of the 2 articles. However, she only now realized that her 4 publication agreements with the journals included a transfer in full of the copyrights. She may be the author, but she no longer holds the right to reproduce the articles in a dissertation. What's her solution? By understanding her own rights as an author and taking greater care with publication agreements, she could have avoided this situation. Most journals would probably support her dissertation, but she now needs to find the right contact for each journal and clear the right to use even her own articles that she has written. A little bit of advanced planning when she originally published the articles would have been best. We all seek to have as many relevant publication opportunities as possible, but we've got to make sure that we don't cut our nose off to spite our face, in the sense that we may hand over the rights to the academic property they're in before we even get to use it for our genuine purpose, which is our thesis. Let's take a third scenario, a third case study, a scholarly book on Asian literature. Carlos is filing his dissertation on comparative Asian literature and is pondering the various choices for open access and Creative Commons. Carlos is a strong supporter of open access to information, and his university requires that dissertations go into the digital repository. That means his dissertation, when complete, is available fully online. His advisor is cautioning him that some university presses might not publish a scholarly book based on a dissertation that is easily accessible in the internet. Carlos's solution: he has an opportunity to make careful and informed decisions about the management or stewardship of his own copyrights. He needs to be able to anticipate his future plans, investigate the alternatives, and make well-informed decisions. Most publishers do not balk at a work based on an open access dissertation, but a few may. So reactions will vary widely amongst the publishers and amongst the disciplines. Carlos should also evaluate his option about open access, temporary embargoes, and different commons licenses. He might explore non-traditional or innovative publishers that have adapted to more flexible terms. By recognizing his rights as a copyright owner, Carlos is positioned to better manage his work, allow appropriate access, and preserve his opportunities for future publications. The situation here becomes the fact that we want to try and get derivatives out of our publications, but they may not be economically viable for the publishers that we are engaging with. And therefore, we've got to plan in advance for these possibilities to work out what is the best strategy to get the outcomes that we as researchers want. You'll notice that through the 3 scenarios, they're not filled with legal threats and allegations. In fact, very few copyright matters in higher education will ever get to that level. I mean, we should be grateful for that, but the scenarios are really about 2 other concepts. First, they are about respecting copyright. It's integrity. Copyright is part of the process of creating and sharing research. We need to respect the copyrights of others. We also need to show respect for our own copyrights through careful management and careful planning. And secondly, it is about the advanced planning and strategic choices that we make as researchers. Solutions to the copyright concerns in each case are possible by learning a little bit more about both the law, alternatives, and then making informed and reasoned decisions that can help prevent problems before they have a chance to interfere with what you're doing or to stall the filing of your dissertation. So although tonight's topic is a little bit dry, these are the areas that I want to explore and help you with so that you can better plan for the future as well. So let's start about the fundamentals of copyright for dissertations. What do we really know about copyright? So we'll start with the following core principles as they are applied. Your dissertation is protectable. That means copyright law, regardless of pretty much whichever country you are in across the world, will always protect original works that are fixed in some medium. For example, they're written on paper, stored in a computer drive, sculpted in clay, recorded on tape, or other media. We have to remember that not every PhD is a 1,000-page written document. Sometimes it can be a work of art. Sometimes it can be code in a computer program. There's a lot of opportunities here. Because you wrote your dissertation using your original words or other expressions, you have fixed it in various ways. Your dissertation is therefore protected. It's very seldom that you'd have a situation that it's not. It's usually protected automatically, but some will argue whether you should register or not register with, say, for example, the Copyright Office, depending on your local area, your country, or even the need to put a copyright notice on the dissertation. Because it's copyrighted upon creation, these aren't necessary, but these type of procedures and formalities actually may be a good idea, and we'll talk more later, but they aren't required. You are most likely the copyright owner of the output, but just let me give you a thought here. You may not necessarily be the copyright owner of the data that you used to generate the output. So it usually, as copyright, it vests initially with the person who created the new work. In theory, if you wrote it, you wrote it. But here's a problem, and some of us have faced this in the past. It is possible that you may have entered into a funding or an employment arrangement that would place the copyright that you thought you had actually with someone else. So you need to review the agreements that you have carefully. You can decide how to publish your work. Students need to consult their advisors, university officials about policies, and also about policies relating to depositing dissertations with the and possible embargoes or postponements on public release of your dissertation. As long as you hold the copyright, you are in general able to decide how your dissertation can be made available, whether it be reworked into a book or divided into a few journal articles. You get to make those decisions. But it may not work that way if you publish in a journal first. And if you give away your copyright, as some publication agreements require, you can lose all of those opportunities and privileges. So you need to be able to decide on this. At the same time, you also have the privilege of allowing use. So it's not a one-sided thing, because other researchers are going to develop from the work you have done and maybe use elements, either a small amount or a large amount, of what you've got. And you can create or attach, a Creative Commons license to your work that permits public use. The works you include from other sources are also copyrighted. Just as the law protects your dissertation, it also protects everything that they've had with that. Now let's have a look at authorship and copyright. Let me just go back. I wanted to mention one story, one thing that happened to me several years ago, too many years ago. The scenario with having an employment contract. If you are working for a university, there is a possibility that your university contract means any works that you create during your employment with the university, the copyright lies with the university. Now that happened for me when I worked at Auckland University, that a lot of the original resources that I was creating that I'd wanted to be able to turn into books, I was reminded that under my employment contract, anything I wrote at my time in the university, copyright, and therefore the revenue streams actually were aligned to the university and not to me. Now that was something I wasn't aware of at the time I became employed. I was definitely younger, so I learned very fast. But it also became a negotiable point for future contracts, as I had to make sure that I still had rights to something that I had created. Anyway, let's move on to authorship and copyright. According to copyright law, the basic criterion for claiming copyright protection of your work are the work has to be literary or artistic. So a book, a thesis, an article, a map, a drawing, or even a painting. It has to be original and creative. This doesn't mean something absolutely fantastically new and artistic, but what it actually means is it has to be something that is new knowledge. You cannot copy whole or parts of somebody else's work and use it as your own. We know that from plagiarism perspective, but there's also the opportunity that we can get it from another researcher who has passed on or chosen to hand over research. That doesn't necessarily give us copyright. And the work has to be fixed in some form, so such as writing, illustration, etc. You have to contribute to the expression of the work in order to claim authorship. The author must make a substantial contribution to the actual writing of the text. Contribution in other ways does not count as authorship under copyright law. So you may be in a situation where you have a research assistant that is actually contributing to what's happening within the research. But if they haven't done the writing, for example, they don't get second authorship under copyright law. If there are two or more authors, though, whose individual contributions to the work can't be separated, they get copyright jointly. Now, that doesn't apply to a thesis, but it may apply to anything you manipulate your thesis to create. For example, journal contributions or book chapters or so forth. In some instances too, you don't have the economic rights to your work. You may be the author, but you actually don't get the benefits from that. That means you may not always retain the exclusive rights of the copyright holder, which include the ability for reproduction, distribution, public performance, communication to the public, or even transformation. So it's really important right from the early phases that you understand if you are giving up any rights and how that's going to impact upon what you want to do further down the track with both your research and your thesis. Our rights depend upon the transfer of rights by contract. For example, work that's performed in an employment relationship or signed away to a publisher. For example, a clause in an employment contract with a university stating that your PhD dissertation has to be made available in the institutional repository, or what's considered green open access, or your funding organization has an open access policy included in their contract. Stating that your work has to be made freely available online in an open archive. That affects what you can get or how you may benefit either financially or otherwise from the scenario. The term of the copyright as well. Usually copyright lasts anywhere between 50 to 80 years after the year of the death of the last author of the work. So in our lifetime, we're unlikely to lose because of the time period, but noticing that every country does it differently. So I come from New Zealand. We've always had, I think, 80 years as being our main number, but looking around the world, the number changes. After the death of the final person, plus the X number of years, the work then falls into public domain, meaning it's free to use by anybody, but you still have to acknowledge the author. So there are a lot of 150-year-old manuscripts out there that we can make use of. The challenge is, would we really want to? Probably not. And finally, we can actually transfer rights by inheritance. So if the author dies, the rights to reuse the work might pass on to relatives, especially if it's not fallen into the public domain. Now, this is going to be really important for us because we might find a diagram or something that we want to use, but the author of the text, the author of the manuscript has passed away. In that case, we don't just assume that we have the rights to use it. We may actually have to seek permission of a relative or other individual to whom the rights have passed on to. Now, these are a lot more complicated than, say, the undergraduate years where all we're doing is avoiding plagiarism. What we're now trying to do is avoid any form of academic theft. And it's simply respecting the original author or the original contributor. So let's go back into author perspectives. Us doing our research, writing our publications, be it a dissertation or be it journal articles and so forth. How do we protect ourselves? And I say protecting ourselves and our thesis, or protect yourself and your thesis, because if you're happy to sign away the rights early on for journals, that might mean your thesis actually can't happen. So the core focus will always be the thesis, followed by the additional publication opportunities that we have as a result further from. So who owns copyright? Yes, you own the copyright to your thesis. If you've started writing it, your draft is protected by copyright. You don't have to have a finished work in order to have something copyrighted. In fact, I have a fantastic book that's over 100 years old. The author passed away midway through doing it, and they published the notes they found in his office, as compiled as they possibly could, as a literary work. Now it's been 80 years plus past his death, but for that first 80 years, those rights were held by others. But it also meant that even though the manuscript was incomplete, it was still protected by copyright legislation. Okay. In addition to submitting your thesis to perhaps an institutional repository, you are free to publish your thesis elsewhere if you wish. However, you've got to think very carefully about how you are using the works of others and the degree of permission that you need to be able to quote from or include other people's work within your thesis. Charts, diagrams, tables. The publisher may request that you get permission to publish. Now, I'm just going to ask you a question. Do you own the rights to your data? To be very cautious about, and when you undertake your main research and the processes that go through, you've got to be very aware of whose data actually is this. If you're being paid to do it, it belongs to somebody else. If you're doing it on your own dime, more likely it belongs to you. I then have the second question. Can I have shared ownership of data sources? And yes, this is possible. It could be co-jointly owned with your university or your supervisor, and often then it becomes your university because your supervisor is a paid employee of the university. So let's go a little further. Should I be registering my copyright? It's actually really important to think about this. Although you automatically get copyright by simply producing the work, by simply writing it or constructing it, in many cases it's worth looking at whether there is a copyright office located within your country and whether you should be registering your copyright with that. Usually the fees are pretty modest and the legal benefits from that are enormous should they need to arise. Now, remember earlier I said, in the academic world, very few cases will ever come forth. But there's always the opportunity that something will happen and you will need to protect your copyright and maybe even your reputation from that. A service such as ProQuest actually gives you a registration service when you choose to file your dissertation. So it might actually make that very easy and affordable and accessible for you as well. ProQuest as an organization, as a network, also helps to get your dissertation into particular libraries, for example, the US Library of Congress, so that every registered dissertation is now part of a searchable catalog and contributes to a varying library's collections. That means it's easier for future researchers to actually find your research. Since I know that we've got someone from the UK here, I think the British Library has a fantastic program at the moment. It's been running for several years, which actually digitizes every thesis submitted in the United Kingdom. But beyond that, what they've started to do is go to the major university libraries and digitize all theses that have permission in order to make them available for future researchers. So I have a book that I've been working on that's actually my mentor's book mentor's thesis, from 1967. And unfortunately, I couldn't get that from him because he threw it away, thinking, of course, he's never going to use it again. I approached the British Library, and because I had a letter of authorization that was simply from the author who said, this person can have a copy of my dissertation. They charged me a fee. They digitized the entire dissertation for me, sent me an electronic copy for which I can only use it for certain realms anyhow. But they have subsequently made that dissertation available online for free for any other student who wants to access it. So slowly this is growing, but it does help that when we do register, that it gives us opportunities for them also to track down the copyright owners to seek permission to do things like this. Now let's talk about Creative Commons and should we be using a Creative Commons license? Creative Commons is a means for you as the copyright owner to share your work with others. The most versatile Creative Commons licenses permits any use of your work with attribution. That means reference. You might instead, though, want to limit the license. So instead of allowing somebody to have absolute access and permission to anything, you may limit what aspects of your thesis can actually be used by subsequent researchers. Now, this is going to be important. Consider you're doing some research that actually has a commercialization benefit or value out of it. If you do not limit how others can use that, I can come along, take advantage of the Creative Commons license and advance your research further before you have a chance to commercialize it. That may have financial implications for you as well. It doesn't apply to every discipline, obviously, but it is something that we need to be thinking about or at least be conscious of through our process. Should we then make our dissertation open access? So as I was talking about with the British National Library that was digitizing theses from all of the universities upon request and upon availability, we've got to ask whether we want our own dissertation open access. Some universities may say it's compulsory. Others you may be able to choose for yourself. Effectively, from a copyright perspective, the decision to make your dissertation open access is your choice and solely your choice. But there is some small potential that open access can limit your future publishing options. So forget the commercialization side that I just talked about. It may simply impact upon your ability to convert this into perhaps a book or some other format. So it greatly varies among publishers, among disciplines. You might have other reasons to restrict your public access to work, especially if you're looking at sensitive or confidential matters, or if your dissertation includes something that's patentable. So that's where the financial comes into it. Many universities, systems like Progress also allow you to request an embargo. So you delay opening access for a period of months or years. This can be rolled over, but it takes a little bit more effort to do a rollover. Now, again, it comes down to, at this stage, as you're writing or going through the process of research to write for your dissertation, what are your planned future uses of it. And then from that, you need to map out what is going to be the absolute best way for you to protect your opportunity to be able to have multiple publications out of the one piece of work. So let's talk some basics. Protecting your own copyright. Okay, it's now vested immediately upon your creating work without requirement or notice of registration, but highly suggest looking into that. You should still, as a very minimum, include a copyright notice on your dissertation or any work that you do. And that's as simple as copyright 2011 Jane Student, or the little c in the circle, the copyright symbol, 2011 Jane Student. It really just needs to be on every document so that there can be no misunderstanding as to who actually is the author. In terms of your dissertation, just make sure that it's in a conspicuous location, customarily just after the title page. Registration is technically optional, but recommended. Let's flip to the other side. We're researching, we're writing up our thesis. How do I use copyrighted materials in the thesis itself? So this is first making sure we don't plagiarize, but it is going deeper. This is about making sure that the attribution is to the right individuals and that we've not left a single author out of that process. So before you submit your thesis or your research to a university, make sure you're probably going to be required to warrant that you have not infringed copyright because they want to be protected from the fact if you have. So we may include copyright material in your thesis without the copyright owner's written permission if the amount you are copying is insubstantial. So a short quote or extract, no problem. We're taking half a paragraph out of somebody's research. That's not an issue. If the copyright in the work has expired, so we've gone past death plus 80 years, or the work has been licensed for public use. But regardless of whether we have to seek permission, does not exclude us from the fact that we still must attribute or reference it to the source author. Under most copyright acts, authors and creators retain the right for a few things: to always be acknowledged as the author of their work, not to have their works falsely attributed to another person or organization. So it's always very important to make sure that as we track something, we track it down to the original person who did the contribution, or we can showcase the progression of that through our attribution. And the most important one that I think becomes increasingly important in this day and age is not to have their work treated in a derogatory fashion. So either some text that is quoted out of context or images distorted or altered, including diagrams or flowcharts, etc., that they may have created. There is a defense that is called fair dealing. So copying a reasonable portion, what is fair dealing and can I use it for my thesis? Of course you can. You can copy a reasonable portion of somebody else's work in an assignment, a thesis, a project that you are submitting for assessment. But a reasonable proportion is going to be deemed to be the following: 10% or one chapter, whichever is greater, from a literary work in hard copy form. So even if we go into a library and we photocopy something, we are legally restricted to 10%. Whether we are morally restricted, that's a personal matter. We are ethically restricted, but that's where the morals come in. We have a limit of 10% of the total number of words or one chapter, whichever is greater, if it is in electronic form. So for example, a blog entry, a report, a speech, a web page, a conference paper, or a work published on CD-ROM. Again, It's what is legal versus what is ethical versus what is moral for our own use. Most of us will happily copy 3 or 4 chapters or whatever's required, or a whole book even, and I'm not going to deny that. But the rules on our being able to use that are a lot more strictly adhered to. And we can also, from a periodical, from a journal, a newspaper, or magazine, one article, unless it's the same course of study for the same research, in which we actually can go further. Now, how we choose to use them, again, it's important. You cannot rely on this provision, though, if you subsequently publish part or all of your work in either print or electronic form. This means these rules are for our private consumption. If we then make these works available through our work and are selling that or making that available even for free elsewhere, then we need to make sure that we get copyright permission from the work, because you cannot rely on fair dealing provisions for this. If you want to publish your thesis or parts of it in an academic journal, publishers will typically not be satisfied with copyright works used pursuant to fair dealing, and will usually require authors to obtain permission for any third-party materials. So it's very important that if you're using it for a purpose that is outside of your thesis, that you take that time and you make that effort to actually get the copyright permissions from that. Let's switch to something a little bit different, because although we've talked about copyright in general and about using other people's, let's look very specifically about images. This is kind of a challenging one, because this is not only taking on board perhaps a diagram or something that has been within someone else's research. This may be including the use of photographs, artwork, or other imagery that contributes to what we are writing about. So it's important to clarify what images you can use for your thesis, your dissertation, or first publication. And it can actually be very frustrating. Even when I come to do webinars, I want to be very cautious as to what images I can take. So if I'm using photographs, I always try to make sure they're mine, or I get them from an online open access source with unlimited use permissions from it, such as Pexels. When it comes into the academic context, I may be doing something with historical research where I'm using somebody else's photographs, or I may be doing something with artistic research where I'm using somebody else's work. So it's very important to look at how this becomes. Our basic guidelines and resources to help with questions that we have about copyright image use. Image use rules fall into 2 main categories. One that is copyright or restricted. Therefore, the creator controls how the work is to be used. Before you can even include a copyright work in your publication, you must get copyright permission from the copyright holder. Now, this is very likely to apply to art, to diagrams and images, or to perhaps historical photographs that haven't become part of the typical marketing world's open access, free downloadable images. The second one is we do have, thank you to the marketing world, public domain images that are works that are not subject to copyright. So these are perhaps photographers or others who have purposely set out to photograph different things that we can use. Now, they may not be protected for a number of reasons. They could have an expiration, so a very old image. They may be ineligible for a copyright because of the nature of what they are or what they talk about. Or they may have been released to the public domain by the creator. So when I come to look at some of the things that I do more from my business perspective than from an academic perspective, we use a lot of imagery. I go to pexels.com very much to get those immediately that I can use, knowing that I automatically have no conflict of interest or no challenges to the copyright there. The third category is going to be fair use, but this is determined for imagery on 4 factors, or the eligibility via 4 factors. The purpose or the character of the use of the image, the nature of the copyrighted work, the amount of work, or the amount of the work, used, and the effect on the use of the work's market value or overall market for its use. So using an image in a dissertation or a thesis under this provision actually requires a lot of research to make sure that we're not put in a conflict of interest type scenario. So always when you're looking at an image for an academic publication, be it the thesis, be it the journal article, whatever, determine what its source is, the original source, not where you found it, but determine its original source and what are the use restrictions. And then you need to go through what can I do beyond that. So let's look at from an academic perspective, where am I going to find my public domain images? So there's a few sites that I'm just talking about briefly. And if you want any more details, I'm happy to drop you guys an email with any of this later on. Images for Academic Publishing was initiated as a partnership between Metropolitan Museum of Art and Art Store Digital Library to provide scholars with high quality images at no charge for academic publications. So a lot of other museums have also, and archives, have joined into the IAP program, and that gives you an opportunity to find a very significant database of image resources that you can use. It doesn't guarantee it's going to give you the images you need, but it may be a helping point along the way if your choice of images has some restrictions. Our Creative Commons become very important. A vehicle that really allows creators and owners to share copyright-free material with others. So we've got Wikimedia Commons, Shared Self Commons, Flickr Creative Commons, Internet Archive, Europedia, or simply through Creative Commons main portal itself. These all give us opportunities where we can get imagery that we can use without there being restriction. Now, having said that, the moment you take an image from a Creative Commons type resource, make sure that you record and maintain some sort of printed proof of where that came from, because you may still be asked to justify that there are no copyright issues with that particular image that you have. A third source is also that museums have made lots and lots of public domain images available in high resolution for everyday use, including academic use. Again, make sure you keep a record of where you got the particular image from and the fact that it was open availability. But it does depend on your research, your topic, and whether one of these particular databases or the notion of any of these particular databases would actually fit in. You know, for example, we may consider that we won't find an image that relates to what we want, but at the end of the day, it's very likely that there will be something we can use in there if we already have something in mind. So let's take a quick look at using other people's copyrights. So before you submit your thesis, and in fact, it's recommended that we do this several months in advance because we want to make sure that we're getting everything across. Have you identified all of the third-party materials comfortably before you file your dissertation? And have you done a systematic review that ensures that you can attribute those particular pieces of information, regardless whether they're image, text, etc.? And have you identified and obtained all of the necessary permissions that you need for it? Let's talk about permission. It's literally what it says it is. Do you have permission? That means the copyright owner has given you a document of some form that says you have permission to use my material. That may be a formal letter that's been printed and signed. It may be an email. It may be a Creative Commons license that you print off their site directly, or it may be something that you've obtained from databases within your university. Whatever happens, make sure that you keep track and keep a record, preferably in print form somehow, of each of the individual permissions, so that if you're ever challenged about, show me that you have the rights to this, you actually do have a documentary permission for that. What about, are you including any materials that you created but you previously published? So think about the fact that along your PhD journey, you have been fortunate enough to publish something in a journal, which is often the case, but to be fair, it's not the case for every PhD student. So it has been previously published. The chances are that during the process of publishing, you transferred the copyright of your material to the publisher. That means if that has happened, you don't have the right to reuse it, even though you're the person who wrote it. So you've got to be very careful. In this case, it doesn't mean you can't use it, but what it means is you may be faced with a situation that you have to approach the publisher of that journal or that book and ask them, the people who own the copyright, for the rights to reproduce the very work that you started, that you wrote in the first place. So this is not about, did I create it? It comes down to, do I have the correct rights and permission to be able to use it? So there's an important lesson with this, and this is something I think most of us learn along the way, because it's very easy to get bitten. Read and negotiate your publication agreements with care. That's the most important lesson. Okay, so when do I expect permissions need to be achieved? Very simple. If we're using long quotations from pre-existing materials, more than 1 1/2 single-spaced pages. So if we're taking the equivalent of greater than 1 1/2 pages from somebody else's work, we need to be able to get permission, because we're obviously using a considerable amount of what they have within the process. Reproduced publications. So examples include copies of standard survey instruments, questionnaires, or journal articles. This even applies if you are the original author again, because you may have given publication somewhere, copyright somewhere else. Now I think back to some of the theses and dissertations that I've read over the years, and some of the older style ones have actually literally included journal articles as word for word, including layout or typography, copies of articles that the person did partway through. It doesn't mean you're not going to get permission, but you need to make sure that's included, because that's the integrity side of things. A third one is unpublished material. If you have extensive reference to unpublished work, it can raise a variety of issues about copyright and also about privacy and access to private collections. So it's very important how we go about doing that. So in last week, when I talked about historical research and some of my own experience going through as an early researcher, I'm utilizing private collections of materials that at that time were unpublished. As such, in order to use them effectively, permissions had to be sought. We look at permissions for poetry and musical lyrics. So fair use for highly creative works is limited. So if we use lengthy excerpts, that may raise critical questions. Some publishers actually require permission for all quotations from poems. So even if you've taken one stanza, it's still something that you may be expected to be able to source and provide a permission for. If we take dialogue from a play, a screenplay, a broadcast or novel, any music, graphical, pictorial works, software or computer software. So sometimes we have dissertations that are embodied in new media, such as on a website or on CD. These may incorporate reader programs or other application software to make the new work accessible or usable. So in this case, we have to explore permissions as well. Sources located on the internet. Now, it's not the be-all and end-all of getting information, but it's a convenient thing. The rule, though, is easy availability does not change the copyright status. Materials on the web are still protected by copyright as if they appeared in any other form. All that's happening is they are simply perhaps in a more conveniently accessible spot for us. And images of any form that have been obtained from copyright sources, so that's covered. Altering an image does not remove the need to seek permission. So say, for example, we do have a chart or a diagram that we have sourced from another researcher, and we've chosen to adjust it in a number of different ways. Now, this can be as simple as common alterations like cropping, resizing, modifying colors, annotating it with text, arrows, or other visual callouts, or it can be more complicated that we are reworking and restructuring the image itself. It still requires permissions. Many of us think if we make enough changes to it, it will be seen as ours, not as theirs. But in actual fact, it is theirs that we have made ours. So again, permissions required. Keep in mind that just because it's there doesn't mean you can reproduce it. And the chances are, and here's a problem, if it is subsequently discovered that you do not have permission to use certain work, you may be required to redact that from your dissertation. So as you've printed and submitted your dissertation, you now have massive areas or significant areas of black, which take information out of it. Either that compromises the process of how you've come to your results, or it forces you to find alternatives to include, which may then have an implication on the strength of what you are saying with your arguments. Think also about material that has been co-authored with others. So during your research journey, you might do with either a supervisor or perhaps another researcher in your department, a co-authored publication. Now, because you're part of it, depends on what has happened. You may have assigned the rights or you may have kept the rights, but you now have a second author that needs to consent to the use of that work in your singular research, because that's without them. We also need to consider permissions for translations of copyrighted work and also testing instruments such as standardized tests, questionnaires, forms, and surveys. So there's a lot there, not a very thrilling list in that respect, but it simply comes back down to the point that when we are making use of any form of text, image, communication from other parties, we need to keep track of the fact that they allow us to do so. Now, sometimes we've got to figure out who actually is the copyright owner, because it may fall with an individual, it may fall with a publisher, or it may fall with, say, a journal that's part of a university, for example. If the copyright owner is an individual, very simple. Email, write to them, explain who you are, how and why you want to use the work, and request permission. The fact that you send an email message with a reply that says, yes, no problem, you have permission. It does not require you to take a particular format. It simply requires that they have acknowledged that you may use this in the work that you define. Now, here's the challenge. Hi, I'm approaching you because I would like to use image whatever for my PhD dissertation. Can I seek permission from you? Not the best well-written structure. I have just limited my use of that to my PhD dissertation only. So again, let's go back a little bit. We have to ask ourselves, what is the plan? Where do I foresee this being used? Will I be using it in my dissertation only, or will I be using it in my dissertation plus a potential journal article? So make sure you cover your bases, but be very honest with where you need it, because you don't want to go back to them and say, hi, me again. I found another thing that I want to use your particular copyrighted work for. Can I have permission for that too? It's better to get it at once, get the person to agree. Now let's talk about commercial publishers. So this is going to be journals such as that might be in the Elsevier range, or it may be from textbooks and manuscripts that have been published for commercial reasons. The fastest course of action for commercial publishers is actually something called the Copyright Clearance Center. Very American in its design, but effectively CCC handles permissions for large numbers of publishers. And in this case, permission to include images and thesis can also be obtained through CCC very quickly and usually at no cost. So rather than writing to the publisher directly, go to Copyright Clearance Center, see whether you can seek permission for what you need through that. Now, some publishers may want you to submit your request directly to their permissions department. That's fine. Go through online form, get the results that come from it. But if you want to make it relatively easy, first try with CCC. And finally, we look at permissions from journals. So if the copyright owner is an academic journal or an association society that publishes a journal, for example, you may still be able to go through CCC, but if it is not available through there, then you need to go to that journal's website and you need to approach them directly. Now, I'm just going to point out, if permission to use copyrighted materials is given on a website, print it out or save an electronic copy of the web page that states this for your records. Saving a link to a permission is not going to be sufficient because you never know whether the link will break or the content of that particular website may change. So from a proof of permission perspective, keep copies of all letters and forms. These are your records. They don't go in your dissertation, but they go in the files that if you're ever asked, say, for example, even further down the track, you're going to publish through a journal or through a publishing house, you have everything ready to say that you can use it. Okay, so the best possible proof is usually a completed copy of permission to use copyrighted material forms. Now you can search these online and there's some great templates out there. You just get people to fill them out. Or an original signed letter from the copyright owners themselves. Okay, originals are best, scanned copies work also. Let's just move into a wrap-up part, which is citations and bibliographies. So this is making sure that you include your full citation for any copyrighted material. This should be obvious stuff for us, but the thing is, when we're putting in something that we've required permission from, we always need to acknowledge that permission has come into it. So with that, the by permission, adapted with permission, all of that reminds us and showcases to the audience that we've got that we've used this. You can have, I've just got a couple of pages of examples, nothing particularly mind-blowing here, but it's simply just about acknowledging that. Sometimes copyright owners will ask you to use a specific wording in your citations. So make sure that you follow those instructions word for word. Otherwise, just simply craft any citation you're making in accordance to your university and your degree program's preferred style guide. There's always going to be a style guide available either through your department or through your university library, and you can follow through with that. Now let's wrap up with something that's important for us, because chances are our thesis or our dissertation is not going to be the only thing we want to get out of this. We want to publish in journals, or perhaps we want to publish book chapters and so forth. So can I post my published journal article on open websites? So let's assume that I've published something. Now can I make it available? A published journal article is really a definitive final record that gives value add because of the publisher. Okay, they've done a different type of copy editing, formatting, pagination, all sorts of things to help your presentation. You can actually use your branded and formatted published article for all of the personal and institutional purposes you need. For example, you're teaching a course and you want to make that article available to your students. However, you've got to make sure that you safeguard. Some publishers are not going to make it available for you to publish, say, online on a blog that's open access. So it's very important to be able to think about where, in fact, you can publish. Now, I know this has been a very dry discussion. What I've wanted to do is to go through and talk about very specific points or very key elements that are important for us to consider. The challenge with copyright is not about, are we generally doing the right thing? It's if we are challenged by an examiner, if we are challenged by a publisher or a journal, can we make sure that we have protected the rights of others, as well as are we making the right decisions today to protect our own rights? So I've come to the end of my very long discussion. I thank you very much for that. Tonight's webinar is on grey literature, something we're probably very familiar with, but may not have given it particular terminology. So let's just ask ourselves, what is grey literature? If we do a quick search, we'll come up with a couple of really interesting definitions. The first one sort of uses some slightly emotional words: ephemeral, fringe, the alternative grey, or fugitive literature, making it sound a little bit more sinister than it really is. More appropriate academic definition is something like grey literature stands for manifold document types produced on all levels of government, academia, business and industry in print and electronic forms that are protected by intellectual property rights of sufficient quality to be collected and preserved by libraries and institutional repositories, but not controlled by commercial publishers, i.e., where publishing is not the primary activity of the producing body. Ironically, the International Conference on Grey Literature provided us with that. So let's go for something that's perhaps a little less academic, or perhaps even a little less pompous. To carry out a thorough search of literature, it's going to be necessary for us to look beyond what is conventionally published books and journals. We are going to need to identify work that is either unpublished or perhaps published in a non-commercial form. This is called grey literature. So who produces grey literature? It's often generated by researchers and practitioners, but it's not controlled by commercial publishing. Therefore, it can be produced by charities, non-profit organizations, societies, special interest groups, professional associations, universities, central government and local authorities, international bodies such as WHO, World Bank, etc., businesses, market intelligence consultancies, think tanks, political pressure groups, patient and consumer groups, and many more. It's quite extensive in that respect. So knowing that there is literature out there that could inform my studies, could inform my research, either in a preparatory mode or further down the track as I'm trying to piece together a story or a theory or a set of outcomes. So a lot of possibilities are in there. Why should I use it? Some material is only available as grey literature. For example, information that has been put together that is intended only for funding bodies, which might include things like the preliminary results of research projects, or perhaps a research project that never got taken off the ground because funding changed or something like that. It is for us an excellent source of raw data, statistics perhaps. It doesn't mean that those statistics are reliable, and we'll get to that a bit later, but it does provide us a source that we can either springboard from, utilize, or go back to the collection methods that were used and help us to inform our own studies. They are often rapidly produced and disseminated. So, for example, conference proceedings appear possibly a year over or a year or so before being in conventionally published journals. And you may have seen some of the conference proceedings, or you may even see some mock-ups for journal papers. Do not publish without permission, or do not reproduce without permission, etc. All of this still helps to inform us, even if we choose not to cite it. Information in grey literature may in fact be fuller or more detailed than what's possible in journal articles, because grey literature is not bound by space restrictions. It doesn't have a word limit. It doesn't have set parameters as to how the output must be visually displayed. Therefore, there may be more to it than we're getting elsewhere. It also enables viewpoints of individuals less likely to publish in journals to be heard. You know, if we take a social perspective, it might be the voice of patients or the voice of victims versus the voice of authority. So it gives an interesting access to perhaps not necessarily more balanced, but more open narratives that may exist. It's also more likely to be very industry or sector focused rather than from a purely academic perspective, which could in fact be wider. So it may actually give us valuable insight into a niche sector or a chosen profession. It has the potential, we have to look at reducing positive result bias. So negative results are more often included in grey literature than in conventionally published literature. So looking for unpublished material is a way of counterbalancing positive bias that may exist through commercial printing opportunities. It can be a way of obtaining geographically discrete information, so something for a very localized area or neighborhood or city. It can offer a coverage of special interest topics that are not often found through our mainstream titles as well. As such, it gives us opportunities to get a fuller picture. It doesn't give us guaranteed reliability and credibility. That's something we've got to analyze for ourselves, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. But it does give us a broader understanding of the landscape of what we might be researching or investigating. So let's look at what type of materials grey literature includes. So it's actually quite extensive, a list, and it's an interesting one because a lot of the things that are on here are the types of documents that I enjoy reading, not only as a researcher, but as somebody who's, I guess, naturally inquisitive as to what happens around him and doesn't always believe in the formal publication. I like to look at a wide variety of sources to help me make up my mind. So let's go through a few of these. Bibliographies, blogs, podcasts, emails, transcripts of telephone conversations even, committee reports, whether it be informal from, say, a small neighborhood committee or something within a committee within an organization, or a government level or even local government level committee report. Conference papers, posters, proceedings, data sets, things that have been unpublished. All of these help to contribute to the shaping of our ideas. We have opportunities for discussion and working papers, something that a university may put out, something that an organization may put out, focusing on a particular industry or so forth. It can be fact sheets, data that's been put together for a certain purpose to try and influence or lobby either individuals or cohorts within a population. Government reports, white papers, parliamentary papers, guidelines, market reports, even newsletters, because newsletters still provide us a context at a micro scale. It may be things like policy documents, manifestos, best practice documents, preprints of publications. So for example, we may get a preprint of a journal article that's not scheduled to come out for maybe 4, 6, 8 months, but it still helps us to be able to look at what somebody else is writing and to use that to inform what we are doing. It may be protocols, guidelines, research reports, standards, patents, technical specifications, even statistical resources and publications, technical reports, other theses or dissertations, especially if they're very, very, very relevant and recent being the most important thing. It could be if we're looking at perhaps medical or public policy, we might be looking at trials registers, for example, clinical trials that have been happening and people's reaction to that. It can also include unpublished translations that help us to look at work that's been done in another language that is going to inform us. Papers that have been published in journals that are issued in such a small edition or maybe distributed free of charge with only a local importance. So they aren't necessarily considered traditional journal publications in that sense because they may not have a huge presence or marketable value. We can look at technical, promotion, or advertising documentation. All of this gives us an understanding of themes or what contemporary practice might be or what the word on the ground is. And finally, we might have underground literature, maybe something that's published against individuals or regimes. Interestingly enough, there seems to be an overlap between some of the notions of historical research and the concept of grey literature. And the truth is there is quite a significant overlap. If you joined my webinar the other week on historical research, quite a lot of the principles of interpretation that we have from there are going to apply to us embracing and using grey literature in our research. Just because it's old, just because it's a little bit challenging in comparison to paid publication, doesn't mean it gets invalidated. But the principles of analysis that we have must apply to both. People will ask, is grey literature academically sound? So this is where it comes to our principles of analysis. The answer is going to be yes or no. Use caution, use your judgment. Without peer review, the quality of the material that is available is going to be variable. But at the end of the day, as a researcher, it's our role to verify, to validate in some respects, to triangulate, to make sure that if we are embracing and taking on board the words of others, that we do so with confidence in its accuracy. Yeah, it's going to be difficult to check both authenticity and reliability of documents. It may be missing things like author, publication date, even the publishing body may be missing. But at the end of the day, there is still going to be an opportunity for us to try and find this and to be able to analyze whether it's something that can be useful. Now, let's assume that it's something we can't track to the extent we don't have full details. Just because we can't cite it doesn't mean it's not going to influence our thinking practices. So sometimes this grey literature may not end up by being referenced in our dissertation, but it may simply influence the way in which we think. It may pose a question for us, or it may push us down a direction that's a little bit different to an earlier direction that we've had. Still, it's helped us with our research. Just going to put up a table for you defining aspects and examples of grey literature, grey data, and grey information. So yeah, there's a few different elements here. We do have grey literature, which is what we've talked about. The defining aspect is it's not controlled by commercial publishing organizations. So this is our reports, our working papers, our newsletters. We have grey data. It's user-generated data, web-based. It might be things like tweets, blogs, Facebook status updates. Yep, social media comes into the grey literature argument as well. And finally, we have grey information. So this is things that are informally published or not published at all. So it might be personal memories, emails, meeting notes. All of these have validity. We've just got to determine at what point and how are we going to let these shape our particular ideas and influence us as researchers, and B, are we going to include these into our specific research communications? So either our dissertation itself, or maybe a byproduct of our dissertation, even a conference presentation, for example. The next table is a little bit more complex, and I think I'm just going to leave it here for a moment for you to read. But characteristics of different approaches to searching for grey literature and grey information. So it's really looking at a few questions. Specific to grey literature, likely to find grey literature on this matter. Specific to grey information, likely to find, likely to be replicable, i.e., can you repeat the study that formed the same conclusions as the literature, the grey literature or grey information itself? Are the results likely to be up to date? And this is one of the advantages of grey literature, that there is a chance, I should say there's more than a chance that it's going to be more up to date than some of the other things out there. But we might also be looking at historical literature or historical grey literature. So that one's debatable. The challenge then becomes, is it easy for recipients to share? That comes down to actually, can you get it? And also easy for recipients to ignore. So is this something that would have been put in the round the round filing cabinet or the dustbin, for example, in the time that it came out? Or is it something that would have been influential in helping decision makers, lobbyists, etc., as they first read it? Some of the characteristics we have of grey literature: it's difficult to identify, challenging or difficult to access, certainly difficult to locate, because there really isn't a referencing system for it. It's often in the form of very limited editions. So unlike a book or a journal, which may be available in multiple forms or significant quantums of copy, grey literature might have a very limited print run. It's often inaccessible via traditional bookstores or online retailers. So we've got to look at alternative access points that we can approach or engage with to obtain grey literature. There's often a lack of bibliographical registration, so we're not going to find it in our university library computer database, for example. We're not going to find it in the Library of Congress database, for example. It's, effectively absent in many library collections as well as the catalogues. It's absent in publishers' catalogues because there's no money-making opportunity out of it. It's difficult to access or acquire through libraries. So again, this is the thinking outside the box. Where do I go to get my resource when I'm not going to get it through the traditional library that would be how I normally go about it? They tend to be unpublished or published with a delay, or they might even be published way in advance of typical things. And they can be rapidly distributed. Now, just to throw a spanner in the works, let's ask you a question. Here's the 50 Shades argument. Are we looking at white, grey, or black literature? And don't do what I did, do a Google search for black literature, and it does really give us something different. But it's commonly used terminology. White is considered published, grey is considered unpublished. Black literature, in context of this, is effectively ideas and notions only. So these are really the ideas that people jot down, but they don't necessarily do anything with. There is, however, still a place for the concept of not only grey literature, but black literature in the shaping of what we do. When we look at grey literature, we've got to think very much about the local importance of it. And that's where it really comes down to for many researchers, is that it is going to be geographically centered on a local area rather than a particular theme or sub-discipline. So it gives some value. For example, if we are looking at communities in rural Southeast Asia, there are going to be some very interesting sources. If we're looking at a theory-based approach, we might not get quite the same rich variety. So in terms of it being localized, it's there to support versatile, actual and local information. So it might be there to inform communities rather than to inform policymakers or decision makers. It may be about supervising local authorities, the promotion of local initiatives, expressing local social opinions, contributing to the integration of the local environment, and helping to form local opinions. So you see the themes coming through, that we're really looking at what it does as part of community building and community shaping, and therefore is going to be something that's more lobby-based than it is perhaps going to be, I should say lobby-based in terms of the community rather than in terms of the authority. The support of local culture and scholarly activities, promotion of small homelands, economic education, providing a forum, maybe just advertisements and announcements, or even just entertainment. But it all provides context, and it's the context that's most important. Now for us as researchers, what really becomes important is how do we go about evaluating the effectiveness or the usefulness of the resource that we've got. So Flinders University in Australia developed the ACODS checklist, and it really covers 6 key things that we evaluate each of our documents or each of our resources from. Authority, as in who wrote it and what was their relationship to the matter of research or the subject being discussed. The accuracy relates to how viable is the accuracy of the information contained therein. Is it fact? Is it opinion? Is it somewhere along those lines? Or worse still, is it alternative fact? Now, accuracy comes through from us being able to triangulate with other resources. We need the triangulation approach to overlap some of the data. You know, we may have a situation where categories don't match up, but they correlate. And that will help to give some identification and credibility to whether or not the data in here is accurate or not. Then we have coverage. To what extent does it cover the subject? Is it something in detail which suggests a significant amount of research has been undertaken in order to achieve the output that was produced? Or is it very superficial? If it's superficial, how is that going to help us as a researcher, other than just a light idea that may pass in the night? The objectivity, actually, it comes down to what was the intention of the initial piece of research? Does that align with yours? Is it even known? Can it be deduced from the information from the written communication that is there? Objectivity is very important because we need to be able to rely on the information that is provided in the context of why the information was sought in the first place. Date, obviously, I mean, okay, I look at myself as a historical researcher, you know, that for some things it's valid, for others it's not. But for those who are doing contemporary research but using grey literature, we want to make sure that we understand where it sits in relation to every other piece of research that's out there, because that will help us to determine whether they've used old data as well in forming their conclusions, or whether or not they're still viable with what they're using. And finally, the significance. This probably can be interpreted in many ways, but ask yourself, could or did this document, did this piece of research influence policy or influence practice in the community of interest? If it did, then it's likely to be significantly impactful, that its credibility can be considered quite robust. If it was more an opinion rather than something that influenced decision makers, then we've got to argue that the significance is not sufficiently valuable in terms of its output, or significantly valuable in terms of how we might choose to go about using it. With grey literature, not all will have a named author or authors. If it does, consider whether or not the authors are knowledgeable in their field and whether they have any affiliations that might have biased their views. You know, for example, political manifestos are always extremely biased towards the group of individuals that they represent and support. That may mean data has been used to represent one aspect rather than to be holistic. If there are no authors named, consider closely the source that produced the report. Usually the source information is relatively obvious, easy to locate. And that should be clear also where data and types of information came from, how it was analyzed, how the final report was compiled. This is effectively transparency of method. The date it was issued should be easy to find. If the report is older, try to find a more recent version or an update. So that gives us information on currency. All right, let's move through. So here's some examples of where you can search for grey literature. Actually, there's a lot of repositories, websites, databases that collect and bring together and make accessible to researchers such as ourselves different aspects of grey literature. So Web of Science, Scopus, IEEE, Business Source Complete, ProQuest dissertations and theses, an opportunity where you can access a significant number of PhD dissertations, master's theses from contributing universities around the world. This is not all universities and this is not all researchers, because people can opt not to make their thesis available on ProQuest. Older theses are now being digitized. British National Library is doing a very good project to digitize all PhD theses that are older than a particular date to make them available to researchers who may need them. Aston Research Explorer, BASE, we have relevant mailing lists such as JISC Mail, social networking sites that are for academic use. So LinkedIn, ResearchGate, do join ResearchGate if you already haven't. I'm not getting a commission for that, but it's one of the opportunities that are out there. NHS Networks, Grey Guide, Open Grey. So a good number of these places that are available. The challenge though is it becomes very difficult for us to search grey literature, mainly because there is a lack of cataloging and records management. So even what I've just talked about, although it brings together a significant amount of the grey literature that is available out there, there's going to be a lot that falls through the cracks. So again, don't just sit at the laptop. You have to find ways to look for and approach people, organizations, opportunities that may be able to provide you with different source material that's relevant. When we look at using electronic methods to access, we have problems, what's called the filter bubble. You know, we get a bias with display limits, we get a bias with algorithms. There are a limited number of search engine results pages. Maybe there's a lack of metadata or controlled terminology to tag, so it doesn't filter through easily for us with, with search engines. Google is predicated on the fact that SEO is a key or important element of what businesses and other organizations do for their website and for elements of that. But grey literature is simply about putting it out there, not necessarily making it easy for you to find. We have a problem with the changing nature of websites and domain URLs. Just because it's in one place today doesn't mean you're going to find it again into the future, which means it's difficult to track back older documents. Hence, as a researcher, and ignore the environmental impact I make of this, but I print absolutely everything I get online because I cannot guarantee that I'm going to be able to access it again into the future. So something to consider, that even though you may not be able to find it again, and that's going to have citation issues, but it can be addressed, make sure that you have a copy of it, because if you ever have to defend your choice of usage of that, at least you can pull out from your files a nice file, accessed on, full URL at the date, full content, so you have a backup in that respect. There's always going to be ambiguity in grey literature documents, so inaccurate titles, lack of reporting standards. There's also a huge potential for organizations to lose knowledge as a result of grey literature being lost or forgotten. And interestingly enough, I was doing some searching the other day, looking for a particular topic I used to be interested in many years ago. And I was trying to download a copy of a particular manuscript that I wanted. But I came across a slightly older manuscript that I'd never ever seen before. And it was only available, on one link. But it was interesting that the knowledge contained therein was good. It was something that had a lot of potential to have been developed. And I know it hasn't been developed because I've read quite extensively in that field. But it's sad that this is potentially literature of value that has now been lost because it's not something that is particularly repetitive online or easy to access in that respect. Let's talk about searching grey literature. And the diagram that is up now, key components of a search, gives a reasonable overview. I'm going to talk about the top 3/4 of the diagram rather than the managing the search element. In terms of planning your search, you need to make sure you develop a search plan. This is a strategy. Where are your potential sources? What are the search terms or search string that you might want to use? What might be the limits associated with this? You need to make sure that you can adapt your search plan to accommodate technological advances in social media, other information sharing systems. But make sure you provide for yourself predefined boundaries and limits for searching, such as setting the number of pages to be screened. This is going to help with time management. Truth is, you can go in with a complex search string and spend 8 hours just looking and not necessarily coming up with the results that you would want. You want to look at your key search sources. So your grey literature databases, we've mentioned a few before, and I will mention a few more shortly. Customized Google search engines. So this may be search engines that are within a different organization that have been designed to limit to a particular field. So university libraries are very good at having these, museums and so forth. They will help limit, but they'll also mean it gets rid of a lot of the unnecessary fluff that has no relevance to what you're researching. Think about the potential to consult with experts and who these key experts may be. So identifying individuals that may be important, making a request, usually via email. And, if they don't answer you after 3 attempts, just give up on that one, because they're obviously not going to be helpful. But make sure you document the request, because when you talk about the approaches that you have made to get information, to get data sources, to do the research, you may want to be able to reflect on this situation as well. We also have to look at conference abstracts and proceedings, because these are potential areas or facilities, I guess, that have value to us. You want to think about your search techniques as well. So the concept of hand searching, it's a technique that is basically involves manually reviewing tables of contents and organizations' online publications to see if there's something of relevance. So we might get a conference we might get a conference report, and there may be 200 different presentations within it. We now need to go through all of those from the table of contents to identify, is there something that is relevant? These may not show up on a typical database or Google-based search, which means it then becomes our responsibility for us to do it ourselves. So hand searching is done to find studies that may not have been indexed in the databases. It is a manual process. It's looking through journals page by page. Often involves looking at each reference in each journal article found. And I've done this myself many times, where I've looked at a particular journal that's been interesting, and then I've data mined the reference list. Or I've gone through somebody else's dissertation and I've data mined the reference list, because I wanted to see whether there may be a correlation or a potential contribution that can use for myself as well. You're going to look at not only your journal articles, but your conference papers. You may be looking at company annual reports, so many different things where you're literally just going to have to do this. But make sure, again, that you document the hand searching process so that you've got records. A consideration that you have to include is language filters. Perhaps you want to incorporate a language filter, but use any language filters with discretion, because excluding information from another language may have limitations. Now, most researchers that I interact with will say, use an English language filter. The problem is some of my research that I'm interested in isn't limited to English publications. But what you can do to make it easy for you is look for translated abstracts first, and then work backwards to the source and see how you want to deal with that. If you have specific language filters in your search strings, that actually may bias findings, because sometimes the actual research is better in a language different to ours. So we might want to include languages other than our language of publication. It becomes warranted when there are going to be systematic differences between studies reported in journals. It may be a methodological difference. It may be differences in findings, which you've got to be, as a holistic researcher, appreciative of, and to be able to think through, does that change anything for me? There may be a situation that most of the relevant studies have actually been reported in a language other than your language of publication, which means you can't ignore them just because of the inconvenience of language, but it's something that we still have to find a way to address and to work with. And we might also have a situation that most of the studies have been conducted overseas, which means the language of the research and the language of the discussion may not actually be in the language that we are using as well. It's about search permutations, and this is basically your search strings. Are we trying to include or exclude? What are the combinations that we are using? The best way is to execute several search strategies containing multiple combinations of your keywords for each source that you've searched. This can yield more relevant hits, but as it yields more relevant hits, it's also going to help you in aspects of triangulation and verification of different sources and different resources that you get. And we might hit a point of data saturation, which is when the execution of additional searches doesn't yield any additional information. So if you find yourself 6 hours in front of your computer and you're finding no new hits, you've kind of hit a limit, and that would be the good time to cease for a while what you are doing. In terms of risks, there is a risk of bias and the value of information. And effectively, any risk of bias comes across within any information as dependent in part upon the question it is being used to answer. All of our research should be driven by questions. So make sure that what you're looking at in terms of the grey literature, understand what their research question was. What were they trying to answer? How does that correlate to what you are trying to answer? And therefore, is it relevant to what you have, and should you be making use of it? I'm just going to come back to some sources of grey literature. And in terms of international grey literature, there's actually a huge selection. You know, WorldCat, for example, holdings of over 20,000 worldwide libraries, 1.5 billion items. You've also got sites and indexes that collect grey literature. So Core, Billyfield Academic Search Engine or BASE, Open Grey, GreySource, Science.gov, Policy Archives, Worldwide Science, ARSIV, very difficult one to say that, PACE International, GreyNet International, Open Door, and even our old favorite Google. All of these are useful for us to know about. And if you're keen, I'm happy to put together a very quick reference guide to some of these. So if you want to drop us an email, I'm more than happy to send that to you as a subsequent follow-up. If we want to look at conference papers, you know, we have conferencealerts.com, which gives us monthly emails of all the conferences that are happening and so forth. Conference papers via ProQuest that can help us give an overview. Digital dissertations in text to scientific and technical proceedings, an element of Web of Science. ZTOC, a research database with 30,000 journals and over 50 million article citations, you know, to conference papers. Then we can look at where we can get access to dissertations, theses, and academic papers. Open Grey we talked about, ProQuest dissertation, Theses Global, WorldCat dissertation. So we see some themes as to the organizations that are doing this, but we have the opportunity that we have access to a lot of what will be considered grey data. And it is in effectively easy to search resources. Now, just to finish off, I want to talk about legal issues. And I want to talk about the legal issues because not only did I touch upon it a little bit, maybe in historical research, but also in copyright in your thesis. We do have to look at the fact that, you know, some of these grey literature elements that we may be investigating or trying to utilize, some of these may still, for our use, infringe copyright. So be very careful about what you use. And if you are going to make use of some of this, as with a lot of other resources that we do ensure that you get your permissions. Do ensure that you get a record of these permissions in case you ever have to defend yourself. And the last issue is about personal data processing. A lot of historical grey literature was probably curated well before personal data protection laws came into being. Now that's fine, that covers them. But if you're reproducing any of this and intend to make use of it, be aware that just because they are protected does not mean you are protected as well. So make sure that whatever you do still protects according to the current level of legislation as of your publishing, rather than what was acceptable in previous years prior to such legislation turning up or being curated to protect individuals. So I hope I've given a bit of an overview as to what grey literature is and some of the issues associated with it. It is a wide area, and what's available in terms of grey literature will differ significantly depending upon what your research area is, your discipline, even your location. But the common themes and principles come down to how are we going to verify, how are we going to define its credibility, and how are we going to use the resources themselves as part of our research journey, even if we're not using it in terms of our final dissertation write-up. It may be used to pose questions for us, or to just get us to think about certain issues from a different perspective. Anyway, I'll hand over to my moderator now, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Craig. Anyone has any questions that you would like to address? Yes, Darlena?
Hi. I just have thank you very much for that two topics. Grey literature is something new to me. I think the question I have is on copyright. So you know how we have questionnaires, and there are questionnaires that you need to get copyright approval from, right? So
Right.
if let's say somebody uses the questionnaire, you've collected data and things like that, and then after you collected data, you notice that, oh gosh, I've not asked for permission. So can you actually then only ask for permission?
Okay, just checking that you can hear me. I think I've turned my mic back on. So what you're really asking for is retrospective permissions. Yes, you can ask. There's nothing wrong with that. It's not the best situation, but even when we look at it, I'm sure that each of us, as boring as that topic was, I'm sure each of us found something that we didn't know beforehand. In relation to our obligations as a researcher. So what I suggest is, in terms of a lot of questionnaires that we may be using from other sources, it's very unlikely that there will be a rejection. So my suggestion is, yes, you seek permissions to use it. You don't need to explain that you've already used it, just that you wish to use it. That in itself may be an ethical question, but I do believe that if you tell the person, or you tell the copyright holder, that you've already undertaken all your research, they will want to extract money from you. If you simply say, I'm seeking permission to use and adapt this in X pieces of research, may I have that? It will probably be quite willingly given. So yes, if you've made that little faux pas of proceeding without, tidy it up before you submit.
Right. Thank you.
Cool. So just do a quick summary for tonight. You know, I do appreciate that both topics are quite dry, and the next two nights will be somewhat more lively than that. But as a researcher, there are so many things for us to think about. And it's not just, us going and doing some research and writing it out. There's a lot of other things that are there. And just as with Darlena's question, we will make some mistakes. We will learn from those mistakes, and we'll find out a workaround for them as well. But it is good as you develop in your career, not only as you're doing your PhD, but anything that you proceed with afterwards, that you get more into that habit of understanding the broader picture, both in terms of what the copyright issues are, but also in terms of how to embrace grey literature to actually help us develop our own ideas as well. What I'm going to suggest is I'm appreciative we've gone over time. I apologize for the technical details issues earlier. I really do hate technology sometimes. But I thank you for staying with us for the entire conversation. Tomorrow night, we're going to be looking at image use in creation. The first half of tonight talked a little bit about the copyright issues with image, but let's look at it differently when we're creating our own image or we're amending someone else's, so how to go about that. And we'll also look at reverse outlines as a tool. It would be a good idea if you have already done some writing, just to make sure that you've got, say, a chapter or a chunk. We might not all write in chapters. I certainly don't. But just to have a chunk of your writing with you so that we can do a couple of activities. If you're one of the ones who are very new in the PhD journey, grab a chunk of your master's thesis or even a reasonably significant essay that you might have written previously, and you can use that for your activities as well. I think, in the interests of time, if there are other questions specifically from tonight, just drop me an email and I'll make sure over the next two nights that we can incorporate them. So over to you. Sorry.
Okay. All right. If we don't have any more questions, I guess we can wrap it up for tonight, and we'll meet again tomorrow. Okay. So hope you all enjoyed the session. Thank you so much, Dr. Craig, and good night, everyone.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you, Dr. Craig.
Good night, everyone. Take care.